Welcome to stage 3 of building the fuselage for the Ben Buckle Falcon. So I've now produced a rigid, strong, square fuselage. I've reinforced additional gussets to keep everything rigid, and confession time, I'd also produced a fuselage that was too narrow. Because I'd built on a jig, I didn't have the plan directly underneath the way I've normally built fuselages, and that meant that when I was taking measurements, I just, out of laziness really, didn't keep checking the position of these cross bearers all the way down. I'd assumed that they stayed the same. I hadn't looked at it carefully basically, and I ended up with a fuselage that was very rigid, very strong, and was too narrow. So I had to think to myself, do I pull it apart? Do I start again? Or do I build it up? Now I know building it up, I'm adding weight to the model, but I'm really talking about a stick and a half of balsa that I've had to use. It's not really significant. And what I've actually done is I've added a quarter onto the outside runners and to the verticals. And that's given me the exact dimensions that the fuselage should have been initially. It's then been tapered down because for some reason I didn't get it incorrect from here down. So it's actually added strength to the part of the fuselage which needs it most. And that's in the centre section where there's going to be force exerted down from the rubber bands holding the wing down, and it's also the part where most of the force is exerted from the wing lift pulling on the fuselage. So it's a price I've had to pay, lesson learned. It won't be the first or the last time I drop one like that, but here we go, we're back to it now. And it's about adding shape to this basic blocky form now. I've already added the stringers, and you can see that I've been able to get away with the error, and there's no major damage done really, other than the weight of this balsa here, and it's not a great deal. Not on a model of this size, certainly. It would be if I was talking about a small free flight model, but we're not. So already it looks better, because we have a little bit of roundness to it. And the next thing is I'm going to add these formers which give the rounded decking aft of the cabin. Well, you notice there's no cabin here yet, and strangely I think the cabin doesn't come straight up. I say strangely, but it's certainly going to look a little bit nicer with it tapering in, but that means that the cabin itself will be made separate and then glued to this structure. So what do we do? This is how I'm going to tackle this. I'm going to glue this one in position, and then I'm going to glue the last one in position, and then I'm going to put the stringer and eyeball it and make sure that it's square and it's not kinking off, because nothing looks worse than stringers when they're all over the place. So I'll pause it there, and then we'll start this process of adding these formers that form the round part of the rear deck. Let's get started then. What I've done is I've marked the centre section of this former, and I've also marked the centre between the two sides on the first one and the last former here. I'm going to glue these in place, just these two, and then line a stringer up to go between them, and then I'll slide the others in, making sure and eyeballing and making sure they're all square and straight as I go. Let's get started then. Using a small engineer square to hold everything in place, and this is a case where the super glue is perfect. I don't need to worry about, I do need to worry about it being clogged up, but I don't need to worry about pinning it and then it wanders off as I'm trying to pin it, because this is literally instant. It's not always the best glue to use, but in this case I think it is appropriate, and you have to be willing to use what's best for the job. There you go, always managed to stick my fingers. So that's the first one done. Repeat the process for this one here. Get it lined up. This one's actually to the back of the cross piece, as shown on the plan. Obviously helps to look at the plan. Lesson learnt, Mark. There we go. And I've pre-cut a stringer. There we go, that'll do the job. Zap that in. And then I'm using the capillary action of the super glue. And that's the process started. Straight away we're getting a bit of shape to this. The underside has a similar set, not quite as high as them obviously, but it'll give a much bulkier feel to the overall model. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to slide each one in turn into position and check that they're not going astray by looking down the strip, so to speak. There we go. That one's fine. I'll get them all lined up, not all in position, before I actually commit to gluing them all in. And then it's a case of repeating for the remaining stringers. These are all, when I look closely at the plan, they're all on the front leading edge of the cross piece. Let's have a look. This second one, I feel like it's too far. That's okay. And then it's just a case of adding glue to each one. And then adding the remaining stringers as we go along. Looks better already, isn't it? I'll make sure that each one's lined up. I'll do that off camera, get them all glued in place, and then we'll start adding the remainder. They are now glued in place, so it's a case of simply repeating the process with one slight modification, and that is on this end former, these stringers are butted to the inside rather than going through a notch. And it's simply a case of repeating the whole process now that we've got them squared up. So line them up, mark them off, and then cut them. Push them back in and glue in place. Just wick some super glue into the joint. You can always go over these with some white wood glue, which I might do. But the super glue really does the job perfectly. There we go. then you just carry on. Now that's short, but it might be useful to simply splice one. I'll use as many full pieces as I can. I'll go alternative from side to side. Not that it makes any difference in this case, but sometimes if you're putting components together and you're only doing one side, you can actually induce a twist into it. It's not really going to happen in this instance, I would think, but it's always good practice. I'll put this last one in, this next one in, and then we'll break, and I'll come back when I've completed it, and you can see the finished turtle deck, so to speak, that I've put in for the rear section. I think that's the correct term for it, turtle deck. So, zap glue on there. Make sure it's holding. Come back up this end. Glue. Just making sure they're pushed in, and of course it'll all be rubbed down. I may sand in between each stringer to remove the former, and the reason for that is when you cover this you'll see a bump where the former is. It looks a bit untidy, so I think I'll make a little round sanding stick and remove some of the material so it's below the surface when it's going to be covered. I think it looks much neater. I think it's something I'll definitely do. Okay, pause there and then I'll show you the finished item. The rear turtle decking has now been completed. I think it looks rather nice, and that square boxiness is clearly beginning to disappear to the Falcon fuselage. Once it has a rounded underside as well, I think it'll look cool. The cabin itself isn't very high, it's much the same height as this, but we're going to have some classic lines, I'm sure. There's a lot of sanding will need to be done to the blocks that go on the front, but that is looking cool after the disappointment of dropping a clanger yesterday regarding the width of the fuselage. Quite happy with that. Haven't thought about it. I don't think it's going to make a significant difference to the weight of the model. Like, as I say, probably two strips of quarter balsa in total is not going to add any weight at all. Not on a model of this size. But there we go. Turtle deck now done at the rear. Thanks for watching. After a little head scratching, I've actually got the cabin area added to the model, and that adds greatly to the overall look, I think. Now what I had to do initially was to make the entrance on the flat over the plan. I added some extra gussets for strength, and then I left it for a few hours to dry. Then I had to do a little bit of thinking, because I'm sure you can see that these uprights are actually angled, because it's narrower here than it is on the total width. So how did I do it? Well, having lifted this from the board, I flipped it over and I made some card templates. Now these are the correct spacing here for the fuselage, and the correct spacing here for the upper entrance. And on the edge I've marked on the position of the 1/4 inch uprights, and I was able to cut 4 of these, the ones towards the rear, this set here, and using this jig I was able to glue the uprights into the top position on this entrance at the correct angle, and when they'd set, I used super glue for that because I didn't want them moving around, I was able to flip it over, and lining up with the correct position on the fuselage, I've tack glued them with super glue, and it's really rigid now despite the small area involved, I made the 2 front ones and that's solid. And that's before any gussets have been added, which are added all the way around the window frames, on the bottom and on the top. And I'm sure that's going to add massively to the strength of the model. You can see that's not actually a very wide opening to get into, but I've installed radio gear into tighter spaces than that, so I'm sure that'll be fine. Overall, I'm very pleased with it. Having made a major cock-up regarding the width of the fuselage, I've got round it, and after a little bit of worry as to how much weight I would be adding to the fuselage by bulking it out with quarter to get to the desired thickness, I've looked back, and of course the original didn't use quarter, it used 5/16 throughout the build. And I'm sure if you add up the total amount of material involved, that extra 16th all round on all of the wood to make this, I'm sure it would have added up to more than the maybe a length and a bit that I've used to overcome the mistake. Lesson learned, wasn't a disaster. We've got there in the end. It's coming on nicely. I'm pleased with the way it looks. And this whole thing's got to be sheeted in. I have to work out how I'm going to fit a tank into the space that's available. The underside needs to have the turtling effect as well. And the undercarriage, which I've started bending, the undercarriage has to be installed at some stage. But I'm very pleased with that. I've enjoyed making it despite the mistake. Sometimes you learn from the mistakes that you make to try and avoid them, but sometimes you've got to just work things out, and that's what I've had to do here. So thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the journey, learned to avoid the daft mistakes that I've made, and I hope it inspires you to pick a balsa knife up and have a crack at doing it yourself. Bye for now.